The shelter smelled of damp fur and disinfectant. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the rows of kennels. Dogs of all sizes barked, whined, or lay curled in the corners of their cages, their eyes dull with waiting. Margaret pulled her coat tighter around her thin frame. The cold outside had seeped into her bones, but it was more than the winter air making her shiver. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her daughter had insisted she needed a companion, something to keep her from spending her days alone in her small house, but Margaret wasn't sure. A pet was a responsibility, and at 74, she wasn't sure how much responsibility she could handle. "Take your time," the shelter worker said, offering a kind smile. She was a younger woman, mid-30s maybe, and her name tag read Lisa. "We have a lot of great dogs. Let me know if one catches your eye." Margaret nodded, but she already knew what she was looking for. The thought of raising a puppy was overwhelming, and she didn't want a dog that would outlive her. If she was going to do this, she wanted to help a dog that needed a home now. She walked slowly past the kennels, peering in at the eager faces. Some wagged their tails, others jumped against the gates, hopeful. Then she reached the last kennel, tucked away in a corner. The dog inside didn't move. A large German shepherd lay curled on the thin blanket, his muzzle flecked with gray. His coat was dull, his ribs faintly visible beneath it. His ears twitched slightly as she approached, but he didn't lift his head. His brown eyes flicked up to meet hers, then looked away. Margaret's heart tightened. "What's his story?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lisa sighed. "That's Max. He's 10 years old. His owner passed away a few months ago, and no one in the family wanted him. He's been here ever since." Margaret looked back at the dog. He still hadn't moved. "No one's interested in him." Lisa shook her head. "Older dogs are hard to place. Most people want younger ones. He's been passed over a lot." Margaret hesitated, gripping the edge of her coat. She knew what it felt like to be passed over, to be left behind by time. She knelt down carefully, the cold seeping into her knees. "Hey there," she murmured. Max didn't respond. She didn't reach for him, didn't try to coax him closer. She just sat there, watching him. After a long moment, he let out a slow breath and rested his head on his paws. Margaret turned to Lisa. "I want to meet him outside the kennel." Lisa's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded. "Of course." A few minutes later, Max was led into a small meeting room. He moved stiffly, his joints slow with age and disuse. He didn't pull on the leash, didn't wag his tail. He just stood there, waiting. Margaret sat in the chair and studied him. "He's quiet," she observed. Lisa nodded. "He doesn't bark much. He's house-trained, good with people, just tired, think." Margaret understood tired. She leaned forward slightly, holding out her hand. Max didn't sniff it. Instead, he just looked at her, his brown eyes deep with something Margaret recognized. Loss. She knew, in that moment, she wasn't leaving without him. "I'll take him," she said. Lisa blinked. "Are you sure? I think it's wonderful, but—" "I'm sure," Margaret interrupted gently. Lisa smiled. "All right, let's get the paperwork started." Margaret looked back at Max. He hadn't reacted to the conversation around him. He didn't know yet that his life was about to change. She reached out slowly, carefully, and brushed her fingers against his fur. It was rough, unkempt. Max flinched just slightly, but didn't pull away. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The ride home was quiet. Max lay in the back seat, his head resting on his paws, his body still as the car moved through the city streets. Margaret glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He hadn't made a sound since they left the shelter. No whining, no anxious pacing, just stillness. She understood it. The drive took longer than expected. The roads were slick with the remnants of an early snowfall, and the sky had settled into a dull gray. By the time she pulled into her driveway, a light drizzle had begun to fall, misting the windshield. Margaret turned off the engine and looked back at Max. "We're home," she said softly. He didn't move. She stepped out, pulling her coat tighter against the cold, and opened the back door. Max lifted his head slightly, but didn't make any effort to stand. "Come on, boy," she urged gently. For a moment, he only stared at her. Then, slowly, as if every movement required effort, he shifted onto his feet and stepped out onto the damp pavement. His paws hesitated on the unfamiliar ground, but he followed her up the steps to the front door without resistance. Inside, warmth wrapped around them. The faint scent of old wood and cinnamon lingered in the air, remnants of the candle she'd burned that morning. She set her keys on the small table by the door and turned to Max. He stood just inside the threshold, his body motionless, his eyes scanning the space. Margaret gave him room. She shrugged off her coat and moved to the kitchen, filling a bowl with water and setting it on the floor. "Drink if you want," she murmured. Max didn't move. She sighed and walked to the hall closet, pulling out the old dog bed she'd bought years ago for her daughter's Labrador. She set it near the fireplace, then stepped back. Still, Max stood by the door. Margaret lowered herself into the armchair, her knees protesting the movement. She watched as Max finally took a slow step forward, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood. He moved cautiously, his head low, his eyes flicking from one corner of the room to the next. He didn't approach the bed. Instead, he settled near the wall, curling into himself. Margaret felt a pang in her chest. He didn't trust this yet, didn't trust her. She reached for the blanket draped over the armrest and pulled it over her lap. "It's all right," she said into the quiet. Max didn't respond. She let the silence settle between them. The house had never felt so still. The next few days passed in slow adjustments. Max ate, but only when the house was quiet. He drank water, but never when she was in the room. He moved carefully, deliberately, never straying too far from the walls. Margaret gave him space. She spoke to him in soft tones, never forcing touch, never crowding him. She let him come to terms with this new life at his own pace. On the third day, she woke to find him lying in the dog bed by the fireplace. He lifted his head when she entered the room but didn't move away. "Progress." She smiled faintly and went to make coffee. Later that afternoon, she sat on the porch while Max stood at the edge of the yard, his nose lifted slightly into the crisp air. He didn't wander. He didn't run. He just stood there, staring into the distance, as if waiting for something. Margaret wrapped her coat tighter. "You don't have to wait anymore," she murmured. Max's ears twitched, but he didn't turn. That night, as she settled into her chair with a book, she felt movement at the edge of the room. She glanced up. Max had shifted closer. He wasn't at her feet, wasn't looking at her directly, but he had moved to the center of the room, where the light from the lamp touched the edges of his fur. Margaret swallowed. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just let him be. And for the first time since he'd stepped into her house, Max didn't retreat. The first time Margaret touched Max properly, without hesitation or flinching, was nearly a week after he arrived. She had just come in from the garden, shaking the cold from her hands, when she noticed him standing near the kitchen doorway. Not pacing, not watching from a distance. Just standing there, his ears relaxed, his expression unreadable. She moved slowly, careful not to startle him. "Hey, boy," she murmured, reaching for the kettle to make tea. She kept her movements easy, deliberate. Max's eyes followed her, but he didn't shrink back. Then, as she turned to fill his water bowl, she felt the warmth of his nose brush against the back of her hand. It was brief, a light touch barely there, but it was enough to still her breath. She didn't react too quickly, didn't reach for him. Instead, she let her fingers graze his muzzle as she set the bowl down. His fur was wiry, rough beneath her touch. Max stiffened for a second, then let out a quiet breath and stayed. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. She had spent days letting him come to terms with this house, this life. And now, finally, he was starting to reach back. That night, when she sat in her armchair with a book, Max didn't just lie in the center of the room. He moved closer. Not at her feet, not leaning into her, but close enough that she could feel his presence in the quiet of the space. She didn't say a word, just let him be. The vet appointment was overdue, but Margaret knew better than to rush things. She had waited until Max seemed settled enough, until he no longer flinched at every sound in the house, before making the call. The appointment was set for Friday morning, and as she fastened the leash to his collar, she braced herself for resistance. But Max didn't fight. He let her guide him to the car, stepping in with quiet obedience. He didn't tremble, didn't whine, just sat still, his body rigid but resigned. The drive was uneventful, though Margaret noticed how his ears twitched at the sound of passing trucks. His eyes stayed, fixed on the window, watching the world blur past. When they arrived, the waiting room was filled with the usual chaos: dogs pulling at leashes, cats meowing in carriers, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. Max stood beside her, his posture tense but controlled. He was used to waiting. When the vet, Dr. Harris, finally called them in, Margaret felt Max's hesitation at the examination room door. His pause stilled for just a second before she gently tugged the leash, offering quiet reassurance. Dr. Harris was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, someone who had seen plenty of dogs like Max before. He didn't rush, didn't reach out too quickly. "Let's take it slow," he said, kneeling to Max's level. "Hey, buddy, we're just going to check you out, all right." Max's ears flicked back, but he didn't growl, didn't snap. He just stood there watching. The exam was methodical. Dr. Harris checked his teeth worn, but intact, his joints stiff, but not failing, his coat dull but improving. "He's older, no doubt about it," the vet murmured. "Probably closer to 11 than 10. His joints are aching, but nothing severe yet. He's underweight, though. How's his eating?" Margaret sighed. "Slow, he eats, but only when it's quiet." Dr. Harris nodded. "That'll change with time. He's adjusting. You're doing right by him." Margaret felt something in her chest loosen at those words. The blood work took longer, and as the needle slid into Max's leg, his body tensed. His muscles coiled, not in fear, not in pain, but in memory. Margaret saw it in the way his eyes darkened, the way his breath hitched for just a moment before settling. He had been through this before. By the time they left, Max was exhausted. He climbed into the car with slow, deliberate movements, and as Margaret pulled out of the parking lot, she reached over, letting her fingers brush lightly against his fur. This time, he didn't flinch. That night, Margaret sat beside the fireplace, watching the flames flicker. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that had once felt heavy but now felt different. Max lay beside her chair, not curled against the wall, not keeping his distance, but beside her. Margaret reached down, her fingers hesitating just above his head. Slowly, she let them rest against his fur, scratching gently behind his ears. Max let out a slow breath. Not tense, not wary, just at peace. Margaret smiled, something warm settling in her chest. They were getting there. The first real snowfall of the season came overnight, blanketing the world in white. Margaret woke to the quiet hush that only snow could bring. The house was still, save for the faint creak of the radiator. She shifted the curtain aside, peering out at the untouched drifts piling against the fence. Max was already awake. He lay near the door, his head resting on his paws, his eyes open but distant. He had been that way more often lately, watchful, as if waiting for something unseen. Margaret had noticed the way he sometimes stared out the window, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. She pulled on her robe and padded toward the kitchen, filling the kettle with water. The scent of coffee soon filled the air, mixing with the crisp cold that seeped in from the old window panes. Max lifted his head slightly when she set his food bowl down. He had been eating more steadily, but there were still moments when he hesitated, as if expecting the meal to be taken away. Margaret sat at the table, giving him space. Eventually, he rose, padding over to the bowl, his nails clicking softly against the floor. She sipped her coffee, watching as he ate in slow, careful bites. It was a small thing, but it reassured her. Later that morning, she bundled up in her coat and stepped outside. The air was sharp, biting against her cheeks. Max followed, his paws sinking slightly into the fresh snow. He paused, lifting one as if uncertain about the cold beneath him, then stepped forward. Margaret watched as he moved through the yard, sniffing at the tracks left by birds and the occasional squirrel. There was something steadier about him, now less hesitation, less tension in his frame. He no longer hugged the edges of the space, no longer flinched at every sudden noise. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, well-worn tennis ball. A simple thing, something she had picked up at the store last week on instinct. She held it up, rolling it between her fingers before tossing it gently a few feet ahead. Max's ears flicked forward. For a long moment, he simply stared at the ball where it landed in the snow. Then, slowly, he stepped toward it, sniffing the surface before nudging it with his nose. Margaret didn't move, didn't say anything. Max hesitated, then picked up the ball in his jaws. He stood there, holding it, eyes flicking toward her. Something unspoken passed between them. Then, carefully, he walked back and set the ball down at her feet. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. She bent down, picking it up again, and tossed it just a little further this time. Max didn't run after it, didn't bound through the snow like a younger dog might have, but he walked toward it, picked it up, and brought it back. A small step, but a step nonetheless. Inside, as the afternoon stretched on, Margaret settled into her chair with a book. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Max lay nearby, his body stretched out in a way that spoke of comfort rather than caution. She glanced toward him, then reached down, resting a hand against his back. His fur was warm beneath her palm. He didn't flinch, didn't move away. Margaret let out a quiet breath, her fingers curling gently into his fur. They were getting there, slowly but surely. Margaret hadn't realized how much she had come to rely on Max's quiet presence, until the day she caught herself talking to him without thinking. She was standing by the kitchen sink, scrubbing out an old teacup, when she glanced over her shoulder and said, "I think we'll make a stew tonight. Something warm." Max, lying near the doorway, lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice. His ears twitched, his brown eyes settling on her with quiet attentiveness. Margaret stilled, her hands still damp from the water. The words had come so naturally, as if she had been speaking to him for years. She exhaled, shaking her head with a small smile. "Well, if you've got any preferences, now's the time to say so." Max didn't move, but something in his gaze softened. It had become a rhythm, this quiet companionship. Max was no longer the ghost of a dog who lingered at the edges of the house, waiting for something that would never come. He had settled. He had claimed his space not just in the home, but in Margaret's life. She had never planned on this, had never expected to find herself opening her house, her heart, to something new at this stage in her life. But Max had made it easy. Easier than she ever thought it would be. The phone rang, startling them both. Margaret dried her hands quickly and picked it up. "Hi, Mom." Her daughter's voice was warm, familiar. Margaret leaned against the counter, glancing toward Max, who had lowered his head again but kept his eyes on her. "Hello, dear," Margaret said, settling comfortably into the conversation. They talked about small things: the weather, a book her daughter had been reading, a trip to the doctor Margaret had scheduled for next week. Then, inevitably, the conversation turned to Max. "How's the old man doing?" Margaret glanced down at him, her lips quirking slightly. "He's doing just fine." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, softer, "I'm glad you got him, Mom." Margaret swallowed. She didn't say anything for a moment, just reached down, letting her fingers brush over Max's back. "I am too," she admitted. That night, as the snow fell steadily outside, Margaret sat by the fireplace, a book resting in her lap. She wasn't reading, not really, just listening to the quiet. Max lay beside her, his breathing deep and even. Margaret reached down, running her fingers gently through his fur. "You're home now," she murmured. Max let out a slow, contented sigh. And for the first time in a long, long while, Margaret didn't feel alone. The days passed quietly, winter settling deep into the bones of the town. Margaret found herself falling into a steady rhythm, one that always included Max. His presence had become second nature, like the ticking of the old clock in the hallway or the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She had stopped wondering if he would ever fully relax, if he would ever stop looking toward the door as though expecting something or someone to take this life away from him. He had changed in subtle ways, in the way his body no longer tensed at sudden sounds, in the way he no longer hesitated before stepping into a room. But there were still moments when Margaret caught a flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of his past. Late one afternoon, as she was tending to a slow, simmering pot of soup, she heard Max shift from his usual spot near the fireplace. She glanced over just in time to see him standing near the front door, his ears perked, his body unusually rigid. Margaret frowned, wiping her hands on a towel. "What is it, boy?" Max's gaze was locked on the door. His tail was still, his muscles coiled just enough to make Margaret uneasy. She took a slow breath and stepped toward the window, peering outside. The street was empty, blanketed in fresh snow. The sky was beginning to darken, the streetlights casting long, soft pools of light onto the sidewalk. Nothing seemed out of place. But Max didn't move. Margaret hesitated, then walked to the door and placed her hand on the knob. Max's ears flicked slightly, his eyes darting toward her, and she hesitated. She turned the lock instead of opening it. Max exhaled, a slow, measured breath, then stepped away from the door. Margaret watched as he returned to the fireplace, his body relaxing back into the warmth. Something in her chest tightened. She didn't know what had unsettled him, but she trusted his instincts. The soup simmered for another hour, filling the house with the scent of carrots and thyme. She set a bowl on the table and sat down, glancing at Max, who had resumed his usual spot. The moment passed, but it lingered in the back of her mind. That night, as she locked up the house, she paused by the door again. Max was watching her, his eyes steady. Margaret placed a hand on his head, running her fingers gently through his fur. "Whatever it was, you don't have to worry anymore," she murmured. Max blinked slowly, then let out a quiet sigh as he lay down. Margaret turned off the light and made her way to bed. Winter dragged on, the days blending together in soft gray light and quiet snowfall. Margaret found herself speaking to Max more often, not in the way one talks to a pet, but like an old friend. She told him about the books she read, about the way the snow reminded her of winters long ago when her daughter was still young. She spoke about the aches in her joints, the letters she still received from old friends she hadn't seen in years. Max never responded, of course, but she liked to think he understood. One evening, as she sat in her chair with a blanket draped over her legs, Max surprised her. He stood from his usual spot and walked toward her, his movements slow but deliberate. He stopped just beside her chair, looking up at her with those deep brown eyes. Margaret reached out instinctively, brushing her fingers over his head. And then, for the first time, Max leaned into her touch. Not cautiously, not out of obligation. He simply rested his head against her knee, his body pressing slightly into her leg. Margaret stilled, her throat tightening. She let her hand move gently over his back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath beneath her palm. She had waited for this moment, never pushing, never expecting. Now it had come naturally, in its own time. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a slow, steady breath. She had given Max a home, a place where he no longer had to wait for something to be taken from him. And in return, he had given her something she hadn't realized she needed. She wasn't alone anymore. The fire crackled softly beside them, the warmth wrapping around them both. Margaret kept her hand on Max's back, her fingers lightly tracing over his fur. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to.